Okay, class, welcome to part 2 of Tuesday's class. This is following up on the ethics module, and we call this little short module responsibility versus accountability. And the reason I like to talk about this is because these two terms get used interchangeably, but they're actually very, very different things. So I like to do a short class on this to help you understand. Okay, accountability versus responsibility. If we were together in class, I'd first ask you what they are. And a lot of you would say, well, it's when you're responsible for someone. I'm responsible for my little brother and making sure he eats dinner. Or I'm responsible for making sure my clothes are folded and put away. Or I'm responsible to get to class on time. And I'd say, okay, well, are you responsible for that or accountable for that? And that's where people tend to get confused, because trying to figure out what is the difference between accountability and responsibility is often confused, not just for students, but in business. And this is a really important thing if you're going to be an entrepreneur, because there's a book by Patrick Lencioni, and it's called The 5 Temptations of a CEO. And one of the biggest things he writes about is choosing popularity over accountability, and that is a fatal flaw for an executive. And so you have to really understand what accountability means, because he didn't say choosing popularity over responsibility. He said over accountability. And so let's get into what the two differences are. So let's look first at this little clip that we have.
This is a story of 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done. I bet this sounds familiar. You've probably played one of the characters. For leaders, accountability starts with looking in the mirror. Being accountable is our ticket to earning the right to hold other people accountable. But in order to do that, we first have to understand what accountability is. Accountability is accepting the responsibility for the outcomes expected of us, both the good and the bad. Anyone who absolves himself of responsibility cannot effectively lead others. It starts and ends with I. I will do this. I am responsible. I will take ownership, etc. You get the point. Once we get into the habit of taking accountability and saying I first, it will provide the ability to create a culture of accountability. However, demonstrating accountability yourself isn't always enough to help someone else be accountable. As leaders, we often need to hold others responsible. In order to do this, we need to do 4 simple things. The first is we have to establish expectations. Here's what's expected of you. Second, we have to gain commitment for that's what's expected of them. Are you on board with this expectation? Third, we have to inspect what you expect. I'll review what you do. And number 4, we need to provide feedback and consequences. Here's some feedback for what you did, or because you didn't live up to your commitment, here are the consequences. Accountability, above all else, is not merely the means of keeping one honest and in check. Remember the story about everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody, and make it your mission to never put yourself or your team in that position.
Okay, so that little video clip does a good job of talking about everybody, somebody, nobody, and anybody. And he lays out for you some things from an accountability perspective. I'm going to go through the actual definitions of the words, because while I think that clip does a great job talking about accountability, I think it misses one key element, and we'll get to that in a minute. So from a responsibility perspective, it's basically pretty basic. You know, it's straightforward. It's being responsible, answerable, or accountable for something that's within one's power, control, or management. When someone is responsible, and this is the key, his or her performance is not necessarily measured. And that not necessarily measured versus measured is the difference between responsibility and accountability. Accountability is when someone is held accountable for their performance and it's a measurable thing. In other words, I can be responsible for making sure that my children grow up well, but I'm accountable for making sure that they eat breakfast every day because it can be measured. Did you feed your child breakfast today? Yes or no? Did you provide them lunch? Yes or no? It's something that can be measured. So I can be held accountable for providing them a meal, but I'm responsible for did they grow up well, because it's tougher to measure did they grow up well, because what well means to people is very, very different. But I am responsible for their health, their well-being, their and making sure that I provide for them the best environment that I am capable of providing. And at school, this is also something. You are responsible for reading assignments, but you're held accountable when we give you a test because we have something that can be measured. So you're held accountable for your learning when we test you. Yet you're responsible for learning when you're reading on your own, but we're not necessarily measuring that at the time. You know, if you think about where we're at with the ethics assignments we did earlier today, you're being held accountable for taking the survey because you have to answer yes or no, and that is something that I can actually measure. You're being held accountable for whether you did a discussion board post because that discussion board post is worth 10 points. See, I'm going back and giving you guys hints. If you haven't done that, to please make sure you do assignments 1 and 2 because there's things you can be held accountable for on those. Responsible would have been had I not said, you know, you're required to do this, or if I wasn't measuring you on it. So that is the difference between the responsibility and accountability. Accountability is the ability to measure a person's performance. So that's a quick little thing on that. I just wanted to make sure that you guys understood the differences. Again, that's all we have for today. You guys have a great day.